As always, I want to thank the Pardes Institute, that's pardes.org.il, for making this class happen. You would think with all the times I've spelled that, I would get it straight, but you know, everybody's allowed one mulligan a day. So, okay, good morning, everybody. We are in class 4 of the sort of foundational thinkers of Zionism. What I want to do today, big picture, is we're going to come to Herzl. There were a couple of people when I originally made my statement that we probably weren't going to speak about Herzl. I got a little bit of pushback from people saying that they didn't actually know so much about him, or that there's, you know, so many different versions, so to speak, of his life. So when we use Herzl to lay out, the fundamental question I have today is, why is Herzl known as the father of Zionism? I mean, considering everything we've looked at today and the story that we'll tell, everything we looked at up till now and the story that we'll tell today, it's actually an important question, I think, and there's perhaps some insights into the larger picture of this sort of upwelling of Jewish national sentiment, which really occurred at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. So that's our task for today. Before we do that, I'm going to start off quickly responding to a question that a couple people wrote to me. Thank you for the feedback. I don't always write back, but I always read it and I try to incorporate what people say into my teaching. This, to clarify a little bit, Leon Pinsker's stance on religion, because I made a couple of statements at the end of class relative to his statements on religion and Kovei Tzion, which I think were not clearly stated because people were confused. And then, once again, just to touch quickly where we've been, and then we'll flow off into the story. So that's where we're going to be. So to begin, just to answer the outline question, I had sort of put forward Pinsker as a product of the sort of assimilationist, emancipationist solution to the Jewish problem, right? He himself was raised in an emancipated household, very deeply Jewish in his identity, but also a lover of Mother Russia. And that tension was, in his eyes, a positive tension, because as we saw, he had this notion that the two calls of history to the Jews of his day were to be faithful sons to their nation and faithful sons to their motherland, right? And yet I offered this turning point in the storms of the South, these pogroms from like 1871 through 1881, which were a turning point in many respects in Jewish history, as a shift. And I want to be careful of facile historiography, of like this sort of black and white, like he was an assimilationist and then he became a Zionist, and that's not what I'm saying. But there was a shift in his recognition that, practically speaking, the solution to the Jewish problem was going to be a national and not an international one. Now, that being said, he himself was not traditionally religious. Nevertheless, the Kovei Tzion movement, which, again, to clarify, what had happened in around the early 1870s, small groups of Jews began to raise money to buy land in Israel, funded by people like Rothschild, ultimately Montefiore. There were others. We'll meet Morris Hirsch today in our story. But these were small communities, usually on what I would call a colonial model, meaning they went and hired native labor, and they were more in the position of sort of landholders and household farmers than what's most people picture when they picture Jewish agriculture is the Kibbutz Movement. That's the next wave, which was all about Jewish labor, which I think we'll speak about next week. So the Kovei movement began without any connection to Pinsker. It began before he wrote Auto-Emancipation, a few years. But because Auto-Emancipation was the first sort of well-received tract on the Jewish problem as a practical political solution, he sort of became a leader of the movement. And as we spoke about in 1884 in Katowice in Germany, there was this conference and he was elected head of the movement. And what the sort of tension is that most of the settlers, the colonists, the Kovei Tzion, were religious people. Important to know that. Places like Rishon LeZion and Petach Tikva, the first two settlements built in the land of Israel by the modern sort of return of the Jews, were built by religious Jews. Nevertheless, that statement with which Pinsker ended Auto-Emancipation, help yourselves and God will help you, and this is the place where I think I confuse people, I put it forward to say that the assimilationist element, which he does represent, because really he felt like emancipation and a liberalization away from the Jewish past was the key to the Jewish future, that assimilationist element within the early Zionist movement will seize upon the first half of help yourselves and denigrate the second, and God will help you. Because we have a conflict between political and practical Zionism on one side and religious thought on the other coming up. And we'll touch on that today with Herzl. So that was just so hopefully by way of clarifying the confusion that a few people were holding. And if I can see the two people who I know asked that question, if I can see a thumbs up, thumbs down, that answer, great, fine. So now what I would like to do is just briefly touch the pieces we've laid so we can see the whole structure, and then we'll sort of put Herzl on top. Remembering that the question is, why do we call Herzl the father of Zionism? We began our discussion with the religious heralds, as it were, tracing all the way back, basically as far as exile being the sort of driver for redemption. But really the personalities we looked at were Rav Alkali and Rav Kalischer. And there we saw that sort of messianism, in the sense that the desire for the end of that unnatural state of exile, and also what a good friend of mine calls progressive restorationism, the sense that moving into the future, progress, involves restoring the glories of the past. If you remember, Rav Kalischer in particular was convinced that redemption depended upon rebuilding, or at least beginning these sacrificial offerings again. And that notion of progressive restorationism is a term I give to you. It comes from Yishai Fleischer, my good friend. And it is a hallmark of religious Zionism to this day. Right? There's a progressive element to religious Zionism, which may not be so obvious today because it's a fairly conservative movement in general, small c. But it's progressive in the sense that the world that is now is not what we want. We want to move forward, but we're moving forward to restore elements of the past, the temple, the priesthood, prophecy, fill in the blank, sacrifice. So that's one side of the whole religious herald, and it's one of the things that will cause it to be such a minor, if not downright insignificant element of the Zionist movement in its early days. Remembering, as we'll revisit again today with Herzl, that the vast majority of religious Jews, be they Orthodox or Reform, will oppose Zionism. And we'll speak a little bit about that. But in addition to this progressive restorationism, we also saw the sort of emergence within religious thought of natural process as a keystone to redemption. Something which seems obvious to a secular nationalist or even a socialist, natural process. That's like they're materialists. They believe in human agency, not divine agency. But it's a radical shift for a religious thinker, right? And so these two things, the progressive restorationism and natural process as the keystone to redemption, are the hallmarks of the religious elements of Zionism. Just remember, those of you who know more about modern Israeli history, those will stay below the surface really until 1967. And then you'll see how the present day settlement movement and the whole national religious world is founded on those two notions. No, Pamela? I see something's going on. You want to say something there? Or you could write it in the chat, that would be helpful. What? Yeah?
I just feel that you denigrate the religious aspect of, if not the formal Zionist movement, of Zionistic impulses.
No, we're going to talk about that today. But in terms of leadership and providing sort of like philosophical guidance, the religious world takes a big old backseat up until 1967.
Okay.
But yes, you're correct. Religious Jews will play a very real role. That's not my point to say the religious didn't get involved. But in a leadership and in laying the framework for what Zionism is, it's a very small piece. So that was the religious heralds. Then we saw in the person of Moshe Hess this sort of socialist, or he was really an idealist socialist, quasi-communist. And there the piece I want you to take with you is this recognition that the cosmopolitanism, notice that all of humanity is going to be part of one community, and universal revolution, that those things are not going to solve the national problem of the Jews. Right? That was Hess's realization. He's not the only one to come to it, but he was arguably the first one to write about it. And what he produced in his book, Rome and Jerusalem, was a new vision of internationalism, right? This idea that there was a certain element of national pragmatism. We Jews just got to deal with our issue, just like the Italians. Remember, that was his model. He was looking at Mazzini and Garibaldi and the whole movement to unify Italy. We Jews can need to deal with our problem just like the Italians, but that'll be good for humanity. It's very important to remember, he never gives up on the international utopianism. It's just a shift from cosmopolitanism, which sees every individual as part of a universal community, to an internationalism which sees the nation as an intrinsic unit, which can then join in the international community. And that, as we spoke about, is really kind of symptomatic of the paradigms of his day, when nationalism was swiftly becoming the sole legitimate conceptual framework for national self-determination. Remembering, as Chuck pointed out to us, that the nation state as a political vehicle is not the same as nationalism. And we're going to see a little bit of that today in Herzl's story. The other piece that I want you to bring forward from Hess into our present discussion is that tension between the particular and the universal, which is that cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, which as I pointed out to you, is a perennial tension of existence, and that the Zohar says is the primary tension that the soul comes into the world to negotiate, and it is the redemptive tension of existence, right? And so therefore, the fact that it's there at the base of Zionism, you can see it playing out all around you in Israeli society today, not just Israeli society, I think you can see it in many societies, but we're here talking about Zionism, so, right? That, the, you know, and you'll get people on both ends, poles like the extremes, and then you get everybody in the middle. What's interesting is that, like Rav Kalish and Rav Alkalai, Moshe Hess has almost no impact in his day. I mean, they're truly heralds in the sense that they're before their time. Right? For whatever reason, what's happening in Western Europe at this point is the reform movement and rapid assimilation that comes in the wake of emancipation. What's happening in Eastern Europe is the sort of first shoots of the Haskalah, of, you know, the Eastern European Jewish Enlightenment that we spoke about last week. And Zionism, or at least these proto-Zionists, these nationalist movements, are just not catching fire. So last but not least, last week we talked about Pinsker, who, if we had the religious herald and the socialist herald, I'll call Pinsker the political herald. Right? He's the one who, like we said, emancipation, the process of emancipation is actually increasing what he calls Judeophobia, which was his own personal term. It's what really had already been labeled as anti-Semitism as we know it, right? And he identified the only solution, remember, and this is critical for what Pinsker adds, is he shifts the focus to the Jewish problem being anti-Semitism. It's not just a political problem where the Jews fit in modern society anymore, because he's coming to a realization that we don't fit in modern society. The indication of that is the fact that anti-Semitism is rapidly on the rise in the 1880s. It's becoming a legitimate political movement, as we'll again see with Herzl again today. And so therefore he shifts the focus. Again, it's not, I mean, to say that the Jewish problem is a question of where we fit in society and the symptom of it is anti-Semitism, it's fine. He just focuses on the symptom, and that's, don't miss it. As a doctor, we've got at least one of them, probably more in the crowd here. You're probably well aware, I see actually two in the same screen. You're probably aware of the dangers of focusing on the symptom instead of the problem. So now it's true, his focus on anti-Semitism and Judeophobia, as he called it, led him to conclude that the only solution was a return to a normal existence, meaning a national existence. He said that the Jew is like a corpse, like a walking ghost scattered amongst the nations, right? And so therefore, the nationalist, the sort of treatment is the solution to the problem of anti-Semitism. But what it will do is it will lay the assumption at the base of Zionism that all you have to do in order to be a normal people is get home. And if you've ever spent any time in Israel, or you read the news, you'll see that it takes a lot more than a physical change of place to become a normal people. And the physical change of place has not shifted the world's attitude toward the Jews, right? That Israel is now the Jew amongst the nations, just as the Jew was the Jew amongst the nations when we were dispersed. And that's something that perhaps at the end of the class, we'll put our heads together and try to think about how is it a product of Zionism as much as it's, a product of other things? Because Zionism is, of course, like everything else, to some degree, a reactionary movement. So that's Pinsker. And of course, he had that grand vision, as we spoke about, of a mass sort of creating of a joint stockholding company, et cetera, and moving the Jews out. Remember, as I pointed out to you also, he wasn't necessarily wedded to Zion, right? He said, if that works best, so great. But if it worked along the banks of the Mississippi, that's that image I gave you, that just imagine if we had reconstituted the national home in Missouri, right? what the Jewish national life would be like today. And it's an idea called territorialism, which will run in parallel to Zionism for quite some time. And notice it's purely a problem-solving approach. If you remember our original distinction between the sort of visionary messianic element and the problem-solving element, territorialism says Zion Shmayan. We need to get out of exile because they're killing us. And if that means Zion, great. If it means Uganda, shkoyach. And if it means Missouri, I'll take that too. Right? And Pinsker is open to the idea, but because he's deeply embedded in the Eastern European traditional, if not religious culture, it doesn't fly. People like say, well, we haven't been praying for 2,000 years to go back to Missouri, right? Like it doesn't capture people's imagination, which is a lot of actually where our story is going to go today. So Herzl, well, last piece is that unlike Alkali and Kalischer and Moshe Hess, Pinsker actually has some impact in his day. As we saw that by the time the first Zionist Congress gets going in 1896, that there are 4,000 members of the Chovevei Tzion movement who show up as a bloc. That's much more significant. Granted, it's a drop in the bucket of European Jewry, but that's a chunk, a movement of 4,000 members. Heck, I'd be happy. So meaning we're starting to see, right, I said that Chovevei Tzion elected him, right? They sent these delegates. There were 34 delegates that came to that conference in 1884. But within the 12 years between 1884 and 1896, you have 4,000 presumably paying or at least registered members. So I didn't say they didn't accept him. Like he was a limited impact, Pinsker. And so the question is, how do we go from a guy who puts out a pamphlet, most of the Jews ignore him, there's a good chunk of them that think he's nuts, and then there's a few people who get excited, Pinsker, to Herzl, who suddenly is hailed as king of the Jews. 1879 what, Peter? Oh, 1897. I keep saying 1896 for the conference. I'm sorry. I have that wrong number stuck in my, yes. The first Zionist Congress, 1897. We're going to meet it today. Okay, so you guys ready? But before I go, questions or comments, clarifications on that background, and then we're going to just dive into the story of Herzl. Yeah, Barbara, let's keep questions on point, please.
Yeah, you were talking about the Zionist Congress. What is this?
So we're going okay. So the first Zionist Congress we're going to meet today. So you don't know? Be patient. We will get there.
Okay.
Other clarifications? Okay. And Peter, I'm correct. You meant to write 1897 because I keep saying the date of the Congress wrong. Okay. So Theodor Herzl is born in 1860 to a German-speaking family living in the Jewish quarter of Pest, right? That's the Kingdom of Hungary, right? Buda, Pest, that whole thing. And he's actually born right next to the Doheny Street Synagogue, which was a well-known place in its day. And he's not just born next to it. His grandfather is an Orthodox Jew in every respect. He's from the town of Simun, where he was the Shamish, meaning the Gabbai, in the Ashkenazi shul. And we spoke a little bit, if you recall, in the first class about the fact that his grandfather was close to Rav Yehuda Alkali. And it's one of the reasons a lot of scholars believe that Alkali's ideas, which included the sort of pragmatic sort of joint stock vision, which plays an important role in Herzl's thought, may have actually come to him first through the religious world. So anyway, but Herzl is raised in a deeply acculturated home. And I say acculturated instead of assimilated because assimilation is a hot button word. It's a hot button word today. And it was a hot button word even in the years following the rise of Zionism. There's an essay by the former chancellor of JTS, of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Gershon Cohen. It's called The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History. It's worth it, very provocative in every sense of the word. I'll write it here if you guys want. Hang on. The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History by Gershon Cohen. I put Cohen. Sorry, that's Cohen. So in his essay, he defines assimilation as the acceptance on the part of the Jews of non-Jewish cultures, languages, and ways of life. Now, you're likely familiar with that classic midrash that gets trotted out periodically about how the reason that the Jews were redeemed from Egypt is because we didn't change our names, we didn't change our clothing, we didn't change our language. So he's pointing out is that actually throughout Jewish history, that's exactly what we have done, right? And not only that, but he asserts that it's been a largely positive element in Jewish life from antiquity to the present. It's the mastery of local and world cultures that has allowed the Jews to not only survive, but thrive everywhere from Egypt to Brooklyn, right? And so, I mean, perhaps the most powerful example of this, people think of biblical culture as the sort of truly Israelite cultures, the non-assimilated. Who built Solomon's temple? It was a Phoenician architect. Go back and look at the text, right? Meaning this idea that assimilation is intrinsically bad, a lot of it has to do with the way things in the late 19th and early 20th century played out between the various sections of the Jewish community, right? And that's Cohen's point. He says that there was an intra-Jewish war that erupted around the emergence of Zionism in the late 19th century and basically turned assimilation into a stick that other people would hit each other with. Because remember, Zionism, for the first 40 or so years, we'll call it until post-World War II, right, is far from popular amongst the Jews, right? It's rejected by the mainstream exile leadership, right? And most Jews will look at that nationalist project as basically a problem to be avoided and not a solution to the problems they were experiencing. And and this is when the Zionists begin to pick up on the term assimilation as a stick to beat people with. I'll give you an example. Chaim Weizmann, who I hope people have heard of. He was the first president of the State of Israel. He was a major leader of British Zionism, a statesman, complicated figure. I'm not going to go into his story because it lies beyond our scope, but I hope people have heard of him. He's a big voice. Listen to his following statement about his own religious education. The head of my school was a Dr. Barnes. A man in his own way was even more bewildering to me than the German Gentiles. He was pious in the extreme of Frankfurt Jewish orthodoxy, but Dr. Barnes was completely assimilated and described himself as a German of the Mosaic persuasion. Now, did you hear that? Weizmann just characterized his teacher as an strictly Orthodox Jew who was completely assimilated. Meaning, in the Zionist view, what is assimilation? It's loss of national identity. And that's going to be a very important plank that gets laid as a foundation for the Zionist movement. Because the inverse is going to be true. If you could be an Orthodox Jew who's assimilated because you've lost your national identity, it means you can be a deeply committed Jew who's not assimilated even though you've lost your religious identity. That the Zionist definition of assimilation will quickly grow into a way in which today, maybe you saw this little tempest in the teacup around the Bible contest, the Chidon Tanakh, right? That one of the moderators made a comment about exile Jewry, and everybody out there in exile land got all up in arms. If you didn't see it, you can look it up on the internet. But that is symptomatic of a fundamental element of Israeli sort of worldview, which is that, well, by definition, Israel is where a Jew not only belongs, but this is where the real Jew is. You might be a religious Jew out there, but you're still assimilated because you're an American, you're a German, you're Argentinian. And that you just saw here in the mouth of Chaim Weizmann. So now, out there in the early sort of turn of the 20th, late 19th, turn of the 20th century, you're gonna have the religious pointing a assimilationist figure at the secular, right? They've lost their way. You're gonna have the sort of sometimes anti-religious Zionists pointing their finger at the assimilated religious, and basically everyone's going to be warring with each other. So I'm gonna call Herzl acculturated rather than assimilated, because the reality is we're gonna see that the depth of his identification with the Jewish people is quite profound. His behavior is not all that Jewish in its day-to-day. Yisrael, you have a clarification? Because if it's something you want to add, if you could put it into the chat, I would appreciate it. But if I've confused you or missed something, I'm happy to clarify.
I find myself confused by an assimilation is like when you intermarry, right? It's not when you live in the same culture and you retain your Jewishness. That's what assimilation is. That's when you tend to see people going away from being Jewish completely.
Not necessarily. I gave you a definition. The definition of assimilation is the acceptance on the part of the Jews of non-Jewish culture, language, and ways of life. And what you're pointing out is exactly my point, which is that the religious will look at the Zionists and say, you're not really Jews because you don't keep Shabbat, et cetera, et cetera. You want to build a nation of Hebrew-speaking Goyim, right? Whereas, whoa, guys, who's just taking over the screen? Abraham, if you could stop sharing the screen, please, and relinquish that control. Okay, Abraham, can you hear me?
Is it still a problem?
Yeah, you are. I'm going to take away that power. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I've actually already forgot who made that comment. You understand the distinction is that I don't want to spiral off into a discussion of different definitions of anti-Semitism. And yes, it's entirely true that we use the term differently today, Shelley. My point is that part of the whole historiography around Herzl is that he was an assimilated Jew who had no identity, and he sort of like had this moment of realization. I'm telling you, he was not. He was not. He was raised by an Orthodox grandfather. Next to the shul, I have here in my notes that his native tongue may have been German, and culturally he was German, but he celebrated his bar mitzvah in the Doheny Street synagogue, and his cousin wrote in his later journals that he remembered him reading the Haftorah in the proper nusach. Right? I'm sorry, you cannot call someone assimilated in the sense of loss of their culture if they can read the Haftorah properly. I mean, that's not the only standard. But he was totally acculturated. He saw himself as aspiring to the heights of Viennese, in particular, ultimately Viennese, but German culture. Israel, your hand's still up, so I don't know if you're just being patient or if you've forgotten it's there. Okay. I don't know how to put it down, so you can just smile. So Herzl went to the primary school, Jewish primary school, up until 10, but he moved on afterwards to the real shul. It was a high school that was considered innovative in its time because it placed its emphasis on studying modern subjects rather than the classics. And that's the era we're in right now, because everything is all about the new, right? That's the hallmark of modernist culture. And it was really at the real shul that Herzl recorded his first experience of something which bound him to his people other than the family and social fabric, and that was, of course, anti-Semitism. So one of his teachers was explaining the meaning of the word heathens, and he said, among these are the idolaters, the Mohammedans, and the Jews. And let's just keep that as a reminder that the emancipated European culture toward which the Jews of Western Europe strived and aspired was still really a Christian culture. It was just a Christian culture that had been secularized, but it had not lost its attitude toward the Jews, right? So that experience of anti-Semitism and being an outsider despite his mastery of culture stuck with Herzl all the way through his higher education at the University of Vienna. He joined the Albia, which is a fraternity associated with the Nationalist League of German students. And if you don't know what that is, you can just hear their motto, honor, freedom, fatherland. That kind of says it all, right? But he joined. His brother's name in the name gave him the secret name of Tancred, which is a crusader hero, right, who was the conqueror of Jerusalem. And it was here at the University of Vienna, while he was studying law, that he first encountered a book that began to awaken him to the problems of the society that he had adopted. There's a book by Eugene Düring, right, called The Jewish Problem as a Problem of Race, Morals, and Culture. Now, Düring was a German philosopher. He was a professor at the University of Berlin, which means he was at the height of not only German culture, but of authority. And a professor of philosophy at a German university in the late 19th century was a pillar of society, right? And Düring, and notice that the book is about Jewish problem as a problem of race, morals, and culture. It is no longer religion and economics. And it's important to hear that. The medieval model of Jews as economic competitors and Christ killers is being replaced by Jews as a foreign element. Not just a foreign element, but as there's a word which I'm lacking in my mind now, something which spoils the purity of the mix, right? And so he says, During says in the book, he calls the Jews the most vicious minting of the entire Semitic race. And he comes to the conclusion in the book that the solution to the Jewish problem is the elimination of the false tolerance of the Jews, right? This is very important in terms of where Germany is going to go. He says humane reciprocity will consist in living in peace, tolerance, insofar as the nobler humanity comes together in the good, right? For the rest, however, precisely battle and destruction will emerge so much more energetically against the inhuman. What he just said to you is that tolerance is something you give to human beings. And when all human beings band together and tolerate each other, then they will actually wage merciless war on I hear you guys saying the sort of indigestible element, the stain. There's a word which is like right here on my brain, but you get the point. The part that is spoiling the mix. And in his diary, Herzl records his horror when he encounters an idea not on the fringes of society, but amongst the intellectual elite. And he writes in his diary that when such infamous stupidities are presented in so direct a fashion, Düring wasn't pulling any punches there, when a cultivated and penetrating mind like Düring's, he recognized his greatness intellectually, with his encyclopedic knowledge can produce such rubbish, what can one expect from the unlettered masses? Now, this is the earliest reference we have of Herzl starting to wake up to the fact that life might be good so long as it's good. And he's there at the University of Vienna, and as we'll see momentarily, goes on to continue to sort of ride the heights of Viennese culture. But if you have a cultural pillar of the highest intellectual caliber calling the Jews non-human, what about the masses who are inheriting still the hatred of the Middle Ages? So this is also the point, it seems, where Herzl began to contemplate that there might be a disaster, a catastrophe brewing for the Jews of Europe. And this is, by the way, one of the beginnings of the answer to our question. Remember, the driving question for this class is, how is it that Herzl is remembered as the father of Zionism? One of the answers is he's one of the first people to really begin to sense and speak about a brewing catastrophe for the Jews, which will paint him, obviously, retroactively, in a role of prophet. And either today or next week, depending on how the flow goes, we'll meet Max Nordau, who was a very important compatriot of Herzl's, who wrote explicitly about what he began to see the catastrophe brewing for the Jews, not as a sidelight of European history, but as a direct product of where European history was going altogether. So most of his contemporaries, Herzl's contemporaries, right? Even though, I see someone asked me this question here. It's actually worth pausing. I see that on Google, it calls Herzl a secular journalist who knew nothing about the Jewish religion. And this is what I warned you about. Facile historiography. You are correct. It's not just Google. You will find whole books. You will find a main line of Zionist education, which will present to you, just like with Pinsker, Herzl was once upon a time a totally assimilated, identityless Jew who saw the Dreyfus affair, which we'll speak about if you don't know what it is, woke up and suddenly became the leader of Jewish nationalism. Bunk. It's bunk. And when you see something which is so patently false and does not stand up to the historical record, the next question you have to ask is, who does it serve to present it so? And that's perhaps what we'll get to at the end. But I just want you to know, the reason I'm building this image of Herzl as acculturated but not assimilated, as a person who senses not only what's happening for the Jews in the big picture, but his own identification with that, we'll see where the turning point lies. So in terms of that turning point, it really, perhaps the first experience he had was in 1883. He's in university. His fraternity, as we mentioned, this sort of German nationalist fraternity, held an evening in the memory of the recently deceased composer, Richard Wagner, who of course at this point had not become the sort of theme song of the Nazi Party because it's only 1883, right? But one of the leaders of the fraternity took the opportunity of this commemoration to speak out violently against the Jews, and it became actually an anti-Semitic rally. Now you have to understand that in the German states, in the major cities, also in France, that political anti-Semitism has come into being, right? The idea that you could organize people's political energy around the identification of the Jews as the primary problem facing society is on the rise. And that, remember, we are 60 years at this point before the Nazi Party. Well, 50 years. But still, it's important to note that they came out, as someone pointed out here in the notes, that Vienna was a case study in what was brewing at this point. And yes, he was right there to see it. So Herzl is the only person in his whole fraternity who resigns in protest. Even the Jews, he wasn't the only Jew, even the Jews let it go. Only Herzl, and I give this to you as another piece of the character, which is that there was something in Herzl that wouldn't let him rest. There were many Jews who saw what was brewing in Vienna. There were many Jews who experienced anti-Semitism despite how acculturated and elite they were. There was something in Herzl that wouldn't let him rest. This is a question I have to tell you is quite a sort of driving personal question for me. My grandfather, Alav Shalom, escaped from Europe in 1937. He stowed away on a boat, told his parents goodbye, no money, literally snuck on, hid in the hold. And I often wonder, like, why? So many Jews. He didn't privy to some startling information. He didn't have some insider track on what was coming any more than anybody else. There was just something in his personality that said, nope, I'm getting out. And this is what I want you to hold on to with Herzl. Another piece of the answer, aside from this sense he had of brewing catastrophe, was it would not let him rest. He must act. Okay, so nevertheless, despite his experiences of anti-Semitism and his sense that something's wrong, sort of in the idyllic world in which he's found such a high level, he doesn't give up on German culture or the states, the city-states, et cetera, that embody it. And after graduating with his degree in law, he tries to find service in the public service in Vienna and Salzburg. It comes clear that a career path at court is very limited for a Jew. And so he turns, as did so many other young Jews of his day, that we saw with Moshe Hess, to journalism, right? He managed to land a job with a very sort of prestigious Vienna paper, the New Free Press, which I'm not even going to bother to try to say in German. Although Peter, if you want to help us out, you can. I think it's Neue Free Press. I don't know. Like I'm not going to mangle another language, but the key is that he becomes the Paris correspondent for this prestigious Vienna paper. He's at the height of European culture in his day, and not only that, he's a competent journalist. But he suddenly gains fame as an author of a certain short literary sketch form, Feuilleton. I'll write it. Oh, you want to say it, Pamela? Will you say it for us? No. I'll write it so that people can see it rather than mangle it. 1 second. And when you see it written, you'll understand why I can't actually say it. It's a short literary sketch on art, culture, basically anything which is talk of the town. It's an interest piece, and he apparently mastered the medium, and it became sort of well known in the cultural elite circles of Paris and Vienna because of that. And it was in his capacity as the correspondent for the New Free Press, as the Paris correspondent for the Vienna-based New Free Press, that Herzl covered the Dreyfus Trial. Now, before I get to the Dreyfus Trial, once again, I'm going to pause. Questions for clarification. People, if I've lost anyone or there's points that I made that weren't clear, you can write a question in the chat, or I'm happy to hear it. But Aviva.
I just need to know, is it During, D-U-R-I-N-G? Is that how you spell that professor's name?
The professor's name is D-U-H-R-I-N-G. I'm sorry, I should have written that down. It's D-U-H-R-I-N-G. Other questions for clarification? Yeah, Yisrael?
I was always under the impression that prior to the Dreyfus Trial, Herzl proposed
Whoop,
Jews
that's
assimilating. What?
So that's
Can-
okay. So I'll address.
That he was really a proponent of Jews assimilating by giving up their distinctive lifestyle and observances.
Was one further than that. There is a record in his journal of a crazy idea of proposing to the Pope a mass conversion, meaning there are elements in his writings that show that he wanted to solve the problem of anti-Semitism any way he could. And you are correct that there was a part of him that would have been willing to sacrifice the particular attachment to Judaism. In the end, he turned away from that, likely for two reasons. One, it was completely impractical. Actually, three: impractical, unlikely to work, meaning because the racial element of anti-Semitism in the modern era makes, as you know, conversion, emancipation, assimilation, it doesn't solve the problem. It actually makes it worse because suddenly the Jew is hidden in the mix. And the third is that he actually did have a deep attachment to his Jewish identity. But you are correct, he was plagued, and that gets trotted out periodically. I'm sure you've seen it in memes, especially in the religious world. They like to trot out, well, actually, Herzl was actually interested in mass conversion. No, Herzl was interested in saving the Jews, and it would not let him rest. And it's true, he was willing to sacrifice Torah potentially for it, because that wasn't who he was, but that was definitely not his driving force. Okay, other questions or comments?
What languages was he fluent in?
Certainly German, French. Beyond that, I don't know. I don't. There's someone saying another one. Pamela, what other one? But you're muted. I can't hear you.
Hungarian.
Oh, of course, Hungarian. Yes, thank you. It was from Pest. Good point. Okay, so on to the Dreyfus Trial. Yeah. Now, the Dreyfus Trial is, you should know, a huge parsha unto itself in European history. We're not going to go there. I just want you to appreciate the fact that for various reasons that lay beyond the bounds of our story, the Dreyfus Trial became a point of conflict between conservative and liberal elements within European society that had little to do with the anti-Semitic side of the Dreyfus Trial that we're probably more familiar with. I tell you that because I want you to appreciate that this is not some tempest in the teacup that Herzl happens to witness that just has a personal impact. This is a trial which is shaking Europe. So what is the Dreyfus Trial, right? Back up because I'm looking at my notes. I had a different introduction, but so here it is. So Captain Alfred Dreyfus was a young French officer of Jewish descent. Now I say French officer of Jewish descent because in 1894, he's convicted of spying on behalf of the Germans. A little bit of context, first of all. Yes, he's from Alsace, right? The Germans and the French, right? Germany came into being as a nation state through the process of the Franco-Prussian War, right? In 1870, 1871. So like the Germans and the French, their national identities are almost by definition in conflict. So he is being accused of treason with the ultimate enemy, number one. Number two, 1894, he's of Jewish descent because the Jews of France, which we never spoke about in the semester course, we didn't get there, we jumped ahead, were emancipated, were given full civil emancipation in 1791. That's a little bit more than 100 years ago at this point. And they weren't just given full civil emancipation, Dreyfus comes from a family which took that ball and really ran with it. That's why he is actually part of the general staff of the French army at this point. And there are all kinds of questions about whether he even saw himself as a Jew. But bottom line, he's convicted in 1894 of spying on behalf of the Germans. He's initially condemned to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, right? But his first conviction begins a whole saga of false accusations, trials of the other person who it turns out perhaps was the real spy. He's reconvicted and he's ultimately exonerated in 1906, you should just know. But that's 12 years later. And his trial was so sweepingly public that that's why they call it the Dreyfus Affair. fair. It's not just a trial any longer, right? Just to sort of like touch that very famous moment that a lot of people are familiar with, sort of like the world famous writer and journalist Emile Zola publishes is sort of an angry open letter in a Paris newspaper, which detailed the whole case, both the fact and the fiction. And its title was J'accuse, like I accuse. His whole point was that there was a deep dishonesty and anti-Semitism which was driving this process, and that it was indicating a failure of modernity. Because for the idealists, for the liberals, modernity was supposed to represent impartial justice, universal citizenship. We were supposed to have left the darkness of the anti-Semitic Middle Ages behind, right? And it's really not an exaggeration to say that for almost a decade, France was split between what are the liberals, who were called the Dreyfusards, which is an unfortunate name, right? Who maintained his innocence and therefore accused the government of all these sort of retrograde medieval perspectives, and the conservative reactionary anti-Dreyfusards, who not only maintained that he was guilty as a spy and a traitor, but many explicitly hated him as a lying Jew, right? So on the other side of Zola in this public battle was Edouard Ramon. He was the publisher of a viciously anti-Semitic newspaper called La Libre Parole, and he was one leading the charge against the Jews, not only in the Dreyfus affair, but in France of his day. He'd written a book called Jewish France. It was a 2-volume work, right? It published about 10 years before the Dreyfus affair. It sold 100,000 copies. And it was a prolonged analysis about how the Jews were ruining France. And he gave a 3-part formulation to his accusation against the Jews, which basically sum up European history. And it's important for us because you can understand this is the environment that, as a correspondent for the Vienna paper in Paris, this is the environment in which Herzl had been living for that whole decade. It's important. The Dreyfus affair didn't drop on Herzl from the moon. He didn't suddenly wake up and realize the French hate us. That book sold 100,000 copies. It's a guarantee that as a correspondent for a major newspaper, he had, if not read it, because 2 volumes of anti-Semitic, vomit is a little bit much to wade through, but I'm sure that he'd taken a look. So what are the 3 elements that, oh, you guys probably want his name. Edouard Ramon, hang on. It's good, I appreciate someone had asked me to do this, and it's a good practice. 1 second. Unfortunately, all these names are not in English, so I can't just type them. I know that looks like it's spelled wrong, but that's how I have it in my notes. No, it should have been an A after the U. Sorry. Edouard. Someone can correct it. So what are these 3 elements of Drumon's vision of how the Jews are ruining the country? Because they're going to teach us a lot about how anti-Semitism, the form it has taken in his day. Number 1, racial. Right? This is, we've seen from Eugene Düring and also Wilhelm Marr that we mentioned before, right? That he sees an absolute opposition between the Aryans and the Jewish Semites. And again, that's a language that the Nazis did not invent. It was a language that was a product of the sort of racial theory, which was gaining much ground in many places at the end of the 19th century. So that's, the first is racial. The second is financial. We know this story. Drummond is arguing that the finance and capitalism are controlled by Jews and that they're sucking Europe dry. And this is that place where the socialist vision saw the Jews as the evil capitalists, right? Now remember that the capitalist vision also saw the Jews as the dangerous socialists, because remember Moshe Hess was one of the founding socialist thinkers. But Drummond's, number 1, racial, which is, of course, you can't get rid of, because a race can only be destroyed, can't be changed in his mind. Number 2, it's financial, which means that there's a structural battle against capitalism and the Jew. Third is good old-fashioned religion, right? He blamed the Jews for the death of Jesus. He was a Christian, and as a conservative was worried about modernity and the loss of religion in Europe in general. So, and by the way, just as a proof that Herzl, that wasn't such a wake-up call, the Dreyfus Trial, 2 years before the Dreyfus Trial, Herzl published a piece on the anti-Semitic demonstrations in France. His piece was called Anti-Semitic France. And he described the willingness of the citizens of what he called the most enlightened nation in Europe to openly declare themselves as haters of the Jews. Now, all this being said, Herzl, in his initial dispatch for the New Free Press, at his first coverage of the trial, did not question Dreyfus's guilt. He just assumed, right? And this is another hallmark of modernity, where the government doesn't lie. Therefore, there's a trial, there are judges, there are lawyers, the accusation must be true. It was only over the coming months, when the complexity of the affair started to get unearthed in the press, that his thinking started to shift. And then in January 1895, when Dreyfus was publicly disgraced at the end of his first trial, right? He was so moved by what he called the captain's dignified bearing that he began to shift. And he says in his, as he wrote in an article in January of 1895, a Jew, an officer of the general staff and headed for an honorable career would not commit such a crime. So I don't think that the Dreyfus affair can be labeled, as it often is, as the wake up, the beginning of Herzl's Jewish identity. But what is clear, as Herzl himself maintained later in his life, this was an unconscious turning point for him in his recognition that something simply needed to be done. That there was no way that the Jews could stay in the world in which they lived. So the there's another piece in here that happened in that same year, which I think perhaps needs to be mentioned. So we said that, you know, the trial starts in 1894. In that same year, Herzl publishes one of his first major literary works. It's called The New Ghetto. It's a play which is basically a cry of despair over the impossibility of European Jews ever really being free within Europe. And he didn't know it, but he began it the day that Dreyfus was arrested, right? And he finished it 2 weeks before he was convicted. So remember, he begins this play when he doesn't even know that Dreyfus is happening. He's writing it, most of it, in the beginning, he believes that Dreyfus was guilty because he was accused by a fair court. But as he's writing the play and experiencing the Dreyfus affair, he comes to the conclusion that Dreyfus is actually wrongfully convicted and is hated as a Jew. And therefore, the play, The New Ghetto, in many ways is a psychological articulation of Herzl's experience during the Dreyfus affair, which is why I think it's worth knowing about. So it's called The New Ghetto. And basically what happens is in 1894, he's on his way home from a meeting, the fact where he'd been trying to explain to the art critic of the New Free Press, right, what the rational basis for anti-Semitism was. And this was an obsession for him. He was trying to understand why does the world hate us? And on the way home from such a meeting, he gets accosted by two young men who call him Sauyud, right, a Jewish pig or a dirty Jew. And he writes in his journals later that that disturbing incident actually brought his thoughts to a boil. And it's interesting he uses that language, to a boil, because like I said to you, I want you to picture Herzl as constantly brooding over the personal and the national question, but because he's saturated in the good life, he's not yet forced to act, right? But this somehow brought his thoughts to a boil, and he says after 3 weeks of work in a state of feverish exaltation, right, that he finishes the first draft of The New Ghetto. And basically he says the whole theme of the play is that the Jews have emerged from the physical walls of the ghetto only to be trapped in the perception that they're an alien, unwelcome element in European society. And the original version of the play ends actually in absolute despair. The young protagonist is a Jewish lawyer named Jacob Samuel. He's dying on stage at the end of the play. It's classic, you know, like dark European, right? Right? Why is he dying? Because he's just been wounded in a You guys are there?
Yeah, you were frozen. You were frozen for a while.
Okay, yeah, I see I'm having a little connectivity issue. But what I was saying is that the protagonist is a young Jewish lawyer who has provoked a duel with a non-Jew in an attempt to save his own honor, and he gets shot And the end of the play is this young man lying on the stage dying, and he cries out to the audience, "Oh Jews, oh my brethren, they won't let you live again until you learn how to die. I want to get out of the ghetto." And then he dies. You know, and in many ways, this exemplifies Herzl's realization through the process of the Dreyfus Trial. So that he may have considered, like Pinsker, that a more real emancipation or reformation of European society, that would set us free. But now, or even the, like you pointed out, Yisrael, even the radical move of conversion. But now when he recognizes the nature of modern anti-Semitism, how it's looks at the Jew as an indelible, indigestible, unchangeable sort of like dross in the purity of European culture, then he realizes actually the only thing to do is to get out. And so that feverish state that he describes is also another element. And by the way, it is, I think, also another part of our answer to how it is that Herzl becomes the considered to be the father of modern Zionism, which is that he had a creative capacity that the others who came before him did not have. Right, and part of that was his ability to be completely consumed by his ideas. And as we'll see shortly, even someone as, let's say, detached or at least in troubled relationship with his Jewish identity as Freud, saw Herzl as an almost messianic figure. So, okay, so the next big, okay, for questions for clarification, and then I want to talk about the Jewish state and the First Zionist Congress. Again, you guys can write the questions in the chat, or if people want to ask. Oh, okay. So we keep going. Give me some sign of life. Yeah, great. Okay, so then the idea of the Jews sort of slowly returning to the land of Israel, right, or colonizing Palestine, as it was said at the time, right? That idea, as we've seen already, is not new, right? It is not. Yisrael, are you trying to get my attention?
Yeah, can you start again because you were frozen? I didn't hear your first few sentences.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. All I said was that the idea of gradual settlement of the land of Israel was not new. What we saw with Pinsker, we saw it with the Chovevei Tzion. We didn't speak about it, but there are even larger sort of colonizing societies at the time that are looking to go to Argentina or places in Russia. They're not part of our story right now, but this idea of needing to move the Jews around is not Herzl's innovation. He doesn't even invent the word Zionism, by the way. That's not his product. It was Nathan Birnbaum, right? That's how I have in my notes, coined the term in the 1890s, right? The power, I think, that really transforms Herzl into the father of Zionism really is summed up in these quotes that he has in his journal from June 1895. So at this point, it's after the Dreyfus Affair, after the publication of his book, The New Ghetto. And what does he say? He says, "As the years went on, the Jewish question bored into me and gnawed at me, tormented me and made me miserable. And I was led to the conclusion that I have no time to lose. More than anything else, it bothered him and he would not let him rest." Now, he, as a writer, was determined to do something written. And so he sat down to write. He thought the product would be a novel, right? And maybe like The New Ghetto simply wasn't enough. And he needed to write something bigger. Novel is always attractive, right? But what actually came out when he sat to write was a letter. It was a letter to Maurice Hirsch, Baron Maurice Hirsch, who at the time was a well-known Jewish philanthropist. He was one of the world's wealthiest people in his day. He'd been very involved in the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Russia of its day. And he was using his money to resettle Jews, persecuted Jews in Tsarist Russia. So he was open to the idea of resettling them in different places within Russia, just trying to get them basically out of town, right? I see that this is still unstable here. You guys can hear me? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So Herzl wrote a letter to Hirsch, knowing that Hirsch was interested in humanitarian solutions, and the two men met at Baron de Hirsch's Paris mansion, and Herzl described it in detail in his diary, which is one of the big benefits we have, is having his diaries. He said upon entering, he announced to this host that he needed just an hour of his time, and he started by critiquing this sort of piecemeal resettlement program, and then he proposed that they turn to the Kaiser, the Kaiser of Germany, with the idea of incorporating a 1 billion mark Jewish national loan fund in order to move the Jews en masse back to the land of Israel, back to Palestine. It was that point that Hirsch looked at him and said, "You are delusional. Get out of my house." Right? And I want you to take this start. Why am I telling you this? First of all, it's a funny story. Second of all, because this is the reality that Herzl will encounter again and again. People, he will be consumed by his ideas. He will propose the most absurd thing. Imagine going to one of the richest men in the world and saying, "Hey, join me. I mean, I'm a journalist, but I'm nobody on your social set. And we'll go to the head of Germany and propose that we're going to gather $1 billion for a joint stock company to move the Jewish people from all over the world into Turkish territory." Ottoman, sorry. Like, what? But nevertheless, Herzl doesn't give up. And he was going to put his energy into writing now, because he felt like he was unable to explain to Baron Hirsch what it was that he wanted. And the next address was, of course, the Rothschilds, the other major Jewish banking family of European fame. And he writes a small pamphlet, which was essentially addressed to the Rothschilds, but was written in a way in which hopefully it would be accessible to the masses, which was known as the Jewish state, the Judenstaat. Right? I want to say right now that if you have not read the Jewish state, it is a must read. It's very short. It's not a big investment of time. I'm willing to bet you could pull it off the internet on PDF. You probably don't even have to find it. But it is worth reading. Well, we'll see why. But I highly encourage everybody to read it. The original title was a proposal for a modern solution to the Jewish question. And that modern piece is very big because in Herzl's mind, modern is no longer piecemeal. Right? What he wants is for the Jews to seize territory on the world stage. Okay, I see Peter just said it's on Amazon for free. Great, or at least in German. That's not going to help me. The key of this book is no more infiltration trickling into the land of Israel through the colonial model. No more gradual purchase of an acre here and a farm there. That what needs to happen is the Jews need to form a unified organization, which can then speak on their behalf to the world powers and negotiate what he calls the return of their stolen patrimony. Now, this is very important because first of all, it's what is called political Zionism. So if you should just know, like if you're going to give something a title, the movement that Herzl starts is political Zionism. Why is it called that? Because it sees the solution to the Jewish problem as a political solution. And in the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th, politics were world politics. You had world empires, which were carving up Africa, what was called the race for Africa, what happened in the late 1880s, right? And Asia had already gone through colonization. Gosh, South America had been colonized and already liberated itself, meaning the idea of turning to the world powers and saying, we want a chunk of land was far from insane. And that's one piece. The other piece is it's an assertion of a return of our patrimony. We're not asking for a gift. We're asking the powers of the world, says Herzl, to use their capacity to give back what was ours to begin with. Right? And in return, as he lines out, is going to be a bastion of European culture within the Middle East. Like Abraham said in the notes there, that the language of that Jewish state is going to be German. Herzl, for sure, and maybe if we talk about Alt-Neuland before the end, you'll see even more of that. But for now, the opening line of this pamphlet, again, published in 1896. So we're only moved a year forward in our story. The idea which I've developed in this pamphlet is a very old one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. right? And like I said, he goes on to point out that in his day, the creation of a new state is hardly ridiculous or even impossible, right? And so the question, of course, rises, if this is such an old problem, why now? But you've already gotten the answer. You know why now. Herzl's answer was very clear, right? That everything depends on the propelling force, he says. What's that force? The misery of the Jews. And a good chunk of the Jewish state is devoted to describing that misery and the anti-Semitism which is causing it. Now, it's also important to note this is not a utopian manifesto. It's the first draft of an action plan, right? And when you read it, some of the things that that are worth paying attention is notice how he subsumes the needs of the individual to those of society in that sort of tension between the particular to the universal, right? The second piece is his negative view of democracy as a form of government, right? Because he wanted the ability to wield power. Esther, are you raising your hand? I see something. No, sorry. Okay, so as we said, so the Jewish state, unlike so we have a question here. Surely if you realize that this land was ours to go back to, it couldn't be considered non-religious. Well, no. I mean, whether you look at the land of Israel as ours to go back to or not, I think has anything to do with religion. It has to do with a national view, because there are plenty of religious Jews who don't see us as empowered to go back to the state, right? But that, I think, is the question that we're going to get to next week. The topic for next week is going to be the new Jew and that whole conflict that lies there. But so Herzl publishes the Jewish state, like I said, in 1896. It, unlike Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation, it actually gets significant circulation. So much so that this new idea of Zionism that he puts forward in the pamphlet is successful in uniting Orthodoxy and the Reform movement in a way in which nothing had done for almost 100 years in their opposition, right? He stirs such heated anger that the label that's put on him is a false messiah. And we spoke last semester at length about Shabtai Tzvi. And here we can see the last sort of shockwaves of the fear of messianism that Shabtai Tzvi left within European Jewish culture, that Herzl is painted as a modern or present day Shabtai Tzvi. But he was under no illusion that he himself was a messianic figure, right? He was simply consumed by an idea. He says, no human being is wealthy or powerful enough to transplant a nation from one habitation to another. An idea alone can achieve that. And this idea of a state may have the requisite power to do so. Right? Next year in Jerusalem is our old phrase, he says. It's now a question of showing that the dream can be converted into a reality. Now notice, this is what I said, that Herzl manages to trigger the imagination of the Jewish people. And it's a slow process. There's far more resistance, either because they call him a false messiah, or they think it's a pipe dream and it's impossibility. There's far more resistance to Herzl than there is support. Also, there's argument, the old sort of demographic argument, right? How many Jews are really going to go back? How many Arabs are living there now? If you're familiar with Simon Dobnow, famous Jewish historian of Russian nationality, who was an advocate for national autonomy within the Russian Empire, that the Jews should stay where they are, but have more self-rule. He argues that, listen to the math, even if 1,000 Jews a year moved to Palestine, which he felt was absurdly high, right? The number would only reach 500,000 by the year 2000. That itself leaves the problems of the majority of Jews undealt with. Now, that's good math, but I want you to know that it's worth thinking about the fact that the professors of statistics at the Hebrew University made the exact same argument to Ben Gurion against declaring independence. They said, we'll never last. There's 600,000 Jews, right? And even if they all come at this following rate, et cetera, just remember, now about 72 years later, there's 8 million, right? So this is it. Herzl was consumed by an idea, right? It caught his imagination, and because he allowed himself to be consumed by it, it caught the imaginations of others. And through that, he was able to actually create a movement. Because within less than a year after the publication of the, well, no, it's a little bit more than a year, I'm sorry. a little bit more than a year after the publication of the Jewish State, Herzl actually convenes in Basel, Switzerland, in August 29th of 1897, the first Zionist Congress. And this finally, Barbara, I asked you to wait right at the beginning of class, but I made it. I also took to heart your point. I want to not rush the end of this. So within a year of the publication of the Jewish State, he's able to pull together, I have the numbers here, that basically almost 200 delegates representing 17 countries, right? Every type of European Jew, Orthodox, Reform, Assimilationist, Nationalist, East, West, which itself is a huge accomplishment. I mean, you know the Jews. Getting different types of Jews in one room is not a simple task. Almost half that came were already a member of some existing Zionist society, like the Chovevei Tzion that we described. And there were others, like I told you, they were sprouting up like mushrooms right now, which again, remember, Herzl doesn't create the idea. He doesn't even really become its sort of political master. He inspires the imagination. That's his great power. He was also good with the pen, which doesn't hurt. But so he draws together at this first Zionist Congress, again, in the end of August, 1897. It was in Switzerland, by the way, instead of Munich, where they had originally wanted to hold it, because the leadership of German Jewry was so overwhelmingly opposed to what they called his insane scheme that they basically refused to allow anyone to rent any space to him and made all kinds of like threats against what would happen if he dared do such a thing in Germany, right? So in the opening address, I want you to picture that Herzl sketched out for this whole, and if you've seen the pictures, if you haven't seen the pictures, it's worth seeing it. He insisted that they dressed for formal ballroom, women in gowns, men in tails and top hats, right? The whole thing was meant to convey sort of both a gravity and a dignity, which was also part of Herzl's power. I mean, you've seen the pictures, right? Herzl's appearance was a majestic appearance. After his address, Mordechai Ben Ami, who was one of the delegates, described the reaction of the crowd. He says, for a few moments, the hall shook from shouts of joy, applause, cheers, and feet stomping. It felt as if the great dream of our nation of 2,000 years was now solved, and in front of us stood Mashiach ben David. Right? It was a 3-day conference, and in that conference, Herzl stamped his not just his personality, but his image in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people. Now, practically speaking, 3 days of keynote speeches, committee meetings, passionate debates. I want you to picture acculturated Jews from Germany and France are discussing Hebrew literature with the Maskilim from the Pale Settlement. Orthodox Jews are talking to atheists about redemptions. Nationalists are preaching to cosmopolitans about the importance of pride. I mean, like this is the cultural mixing pot of probably the greatest power that European Jewry had seen up to this point, right? And what emerges out of it is actually a popular movement. They do elect a president. Herzl is the first president of the World Zionist Organization, which exists today. They just had their elections. I don't know if anybody voted, but they just had their elections. That is the vote that just took place for the World Zionist Organization had its origins at the first Zionist Congress. It was the creation of a political organization called the Zionist Movement. Beyond ideas, beyond passionate associations and private enterprise, you now have a political association to which you can pay a membership fee, which gives you the right to vote, and it exists to this very day. It's a whole different discussion of why such an organization still exists when nominally they already succeeded in creating the Jewish state. That's actually an important discussion, but I'm just putting it on the board for you to contemplate. I don't want to go there now. Aside from the political institutions, perhaps and of course the adoption of Hatikvah as the national anthem, which is not a small thing, because the national anthem is a tremendously powerful rallying point, right? And the election of Herzl, as I said, as the president of the Zionist organization, right? Aside from that, the real outcome of the first Zionist Congress is what's known as the Basel Program. Basel, Switzerland, right? And it's going to set the course for the Zionist movement for the foreseeable future, although you'll see in the elements that there was a lot of conflict, because obviously I'm telling one very narrow piece of this story. All these different elements that go into making up the Zionist movement all had voice. Not everybody agreed. Like I said, the Jews. And we'll speak a little bit more next week about the competing streams and the influence they had into crafting a modern Jewish identity. But for now, the Basel Program, just on a basic level, has 4 points. Number one, the promotion of appropriate means of settlement in the land of Israel of Jewish farmers, artisans, and manufacturers. This is what we call pragmatism. Just make it possible if some guy wants to move to Israel, right? Get a loan fund together, get some support, meaning individuals. Notice it's settlement of farmers, artisans, and manufacturers. That's the pragmatism to which Herzl was opposed, remember. Right? This was a point that he lost. He wanted a grand scheme. He didn't want this guy, that guy. He wanted all the Jews, get the Kaiser to talk to the Sultan, and they're going to give us the whole pie at once. But nevertheless, that's the first. Number two, organization and uniting of the whole of Jewry by means of appropriate institutions, local and international, in accordance with the laws of each country. He wants to make Zionism the representative movement of all world Jewry. That's a big aspiration. And if you know some of the history of European Jewry or American Jewry, you know that Zionists were the minority, and often a despised minority, right up and through World War II. In America, people are shocked by the sort of rise of an anti-Zionist American Jewry today. You shouldn't be shocked. It's just a return to much of its roots, right? And that's a discussion that I'm happy to share with you, podcasts that I have on the topic. But so that's one, is make it possible for individuals to go and succeed financially. Two, create an organization that will bind all world Jewry together into one political organization. Three, strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and consciousness. That's cultural work. You got to educate the people. I mean, like teaching Hebrew, even teaching Jews that they're a nation. Remember, we saw from Chaim Weizmann this quote about his religious teacher who saw himself as a German of Mosaic persuasion. It takes work to cultivate a national consciousness. And so that means also funds and energy devoted to it. These are the 4 points. So again, one, make it possible for the individual to go and succeed financially. Two, make a global political organization that will bind world Jewry together. Three, cultural political work to educate people toward a national consciousness. And four, steps toward obtaining the consent of governments in order to reach the goals of Zionism. That's classic political Zionism. We're going to go out, we're going to talk to the Kaiser, we're going to talk to the Sultan, we're going to try to get the whole thing at once and not just piecemeal it. This is known as the Basel Program, and through it, and through the First Zionist Congress, Herzl suddenly is rocketed to an international standing. Overnight, basically overnight, he found himself engaged in what we call shuttle diplomacy. He meets the Kaiser of Germany in Istanbul in 1898, the very next year, and then again in Jerusalem with the aim of convincing him to put pressure on the Sultan, like I said, to give the Jews basically a joint stockholdership in Palestine. He fails, right? But nevertheless, he's standing in front of kings, and he's being seen and treated as the king of the Jews. And this is the ineffable piece here, is that he's received as the leader of a people who have not appointed him as such. And yet everywhere he goes, Jews of almost every type feel that he looks like a king. And that's what I said. I mean, there's a whole side to this of the aesthetics, which really, can be looked at. The sort of majestic beard, the lofty forehead, his bearing and nature of speech had a huge impact because it didn't strike people as the crouching Jew. So I see a question here from Goldo: why do world leaders give him an audience? Is it his charisma? That is definitely part of it. Remember, of course, you never just walk into the Kaiser. You got to find the guy who knows the guy, gets the guy. And he has a tremendous personal charisma. He looks the part. And because he's working with people like Rothschild and Baron Hirsch to try, Jews have a lot of influence if they don't have a lot of power. But he manages to get these audiences. Just to give you an appreciation of the impact of his persona, in 1902, which is not long before Herzl dies, Freud mails to Herzl a copy of his sort of foundational work, The Interpretation of Dreams, right? Nominally, it's for him to review for the New Free Press, because Herzl's still a journalist, right? Because Freud, of course, is also in Vienna. But at the end of the letter he sends along with the book, he expresses his high personal regard for Herzl. He says, but in any event, meaning whether you review it or not, I ask you to keep the book as a token of the high esteem which I, like so many others, have for many years regarded the poet and fighter for the human rights of our peoples. He says in 1894, he'd seen Herzl's play, The New Ghetto, and it struck just such a deep chord in him, right, that he relates a dream in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. He relates a dream that was triggered in he himself, in Freud, by the play. Right? He says that the dream was constructed on a tangle of thoughts provoked by a play which I had seen called The New Ghetto. The Jewish problem, concern about the future of one's children to whom one cannot give a country of their own, concern about educating them in such a way that they can move freely across frontiers. Now, I want you to appreciate this as an example. Freud was not known as a nationalist, to say the least. Freud is arguably one of the archetypes of cosmopolitan Jewish culture. But there was something in the passion that Herzl was able to communicate, both in his play, The New Ghetto, and he later actually, Freud writes a letter to Herzl's son many years after Herzl's death and says, your father is one of those men who have transformed dreams into reality. People of this sort, Garibaldi's, Herzl's, are very rare and dangerous. That there is something ineffable in Herzl's personality, call it charisma, call it what you will, that struck a chord which was well beyond anything that any Jewish leader had done outside of their immediate circles at this point. Perhaps since, who would you compare him to? Shabtai Tzvi. If you recall, those of us who were in the semester together last semester, that Shabtai Tzvi also had this tremendous capacity to simply get to the Sultan, to talk to people, that, you know, and there was some ineffable quality that people were attracted to him. I guess that's what we call charisma. So just to round Herzl's story out, because I can see we have not a tremendous amount of time left, that so he wrote in his journal a few days after the Basel Conference that were I to sum up the Basel Conference in a word, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Remember, it's 1897. 200 delegates is impressive, but to say that at Basel he founded the Jewish state is insane. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it. Now I want you to appreciate, he wrote that in 1897. 50 years later was 1947, right? And that's why, of course, Herzl's most famous statement is, if you will it, it is no dream. That in many ways, what makes Herzl the founder of modern Zionism, like I said, first of all, he was bothered by the plight of his people, but that doesn't make him unique. Second of all, it would not let him rest. He had to take action, but also, we saw Pinsker, Haas, others, that wouldn't make them unique either, right? It was his capacity to dream and to infect others with that dream, to trigger the imagination of the people around him, which really gave him, just think of that statement, today I founded the Jewish state. And next week, we'll look at the people who are opposed to him, we'll look at some of his fellow travelers. Just so you know, I want to look a little bit at Max Nordau and Asher Ginsburg, known as Achad Am, which who will fill out for us, and maybe a little bit of A.D. Gordon, just to understand the new identity which is going to emerge out of this process. But for now, I'll leave time for a couple of questions, but just to give you the end of his story, obviously leaving out a lot of it, but in 1903, there were terrible pogroms in Kishinev in Russia, which we'll give more details about maybe next week. But those pogroms and the general state of Russian Jewry that Herzl had gone to see for himself made him actually convinced that something immediate needed to be done on the mass political scale. And so he turned to the British Empire, again, standing before kings, and actually got an offer from the British of what's known as the Uganda program. Right? People may be familiar with it. The British basically offered to give a big chunk of land within Africa for the Jews to take refuge. Why? Whether that would have really happened is not so important to us. I want you to understand that the fight over the Uganda program within the Zionist movement, which is eventually voted it down, in many ways broke his heart. Because in 1904, he was basically, and having had worked incessantly, traveling the world, trying to convince the Jews, the leaders of the world, that this was a project which must come to be. In 1904, Herzl basically dies of, you could say, pneumonia, you could say of a broken heart, right? But basically, he burnt himself out in service of this dream which had lit him on fire only a few years before. But on that note, and going back to this whole question of Herzl and his Jewish identity, I'll give you this final image. That a couple of years after the publication of the Jewish State, which was just a few months after the close of the First Zionist Congress, Herzl wrote a short story called The Menorah. Not one of his better known works, but it's the story of an artist who survives an existential crisis and discovers his own Jewish identity while lighting the Hanukkah candles. Right? And this artist in the book is a man who deep in his soul felt the need to be a Jew. And I'm sure you see where this is going. Right here he is 4 months after the Basel Conference, and he's writing a short story about someone who, after an existential crisis, awoke to the need to be a Jew. And in the ending scene of the short story, the artist is sitting, because the story happens as, of course, you're lighting the candles gradually over the course of 8 days, and this feeling is growing within him, and he's sitting in front of the fully lit menorah, and he says, for our friend, meaning the artist in the story, the occasion became a parable for the enkindling of a whole nation. First one candle, it's still dark and the solitary light looks gloomy. Then it finds a companion, then another, the darkness must retreat. When all the candles are ablaze, everyone must stop in amazement at what has been wrought. And no office is more blessed than that of a shamash, right? That of basically the servant of light, right? And really, that was the role that Herzl played. And it's why I believe he's remembered as the father of the modern Zionist movement. Because whatever qualities of soul, of character, of personality, of ability he had, he put them all into service to the point where he burnt out. But his statement that the Jewish state is essential to the world and it therefore will be created actually became a reality which he never lived to see. Though you should know, he dies in 1904 and he's buried in Europe, but his body, of course, was brought by the modern state of Israel and reinterred at Mount Herzl, of course, in 1949. So he didn't live to see his dream, but he did come to rest there. So that's it for Herzl right now. We will pick up next week with the personalities, as I mentioned, probably of Ahad Ha'am and Max Nordau. And the goal is really going to be to understand what is this new Jew that arises in thought together with the idea of a Jewish homeland. So thanks, guys. People want to ask questions or make comments, I got a couple minutes left.
Okay, I have a question, Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, before he got involved with this idea, before he started expressing his Zionist urges, would he have been regarded, or was he regarded by people as someone of magnetism, someone with charisma? Is this the report that we were getting, or did it require both those things together to fire him up?
And it's an interesting question. I would say he was known for his literary work, but I haven't seen any evidence, and again, I haven't done massive research, but I haven't seen any evidence that he was particularly known as a charismatic individual. What he was known as is someone who wasn't so mentally stable. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to Max Nordau.
Yeah.
Okay, it's 1:45. So Israel, is that you raising your hand again? This time I'm actually going to call on you.
Yeah.
All right, folks, feel free to go. I don't want to hold anyone. But you're welcome to stick around for a couple minutes.
Mike, I just want you to know, I sent you the text both for the Jewish state and for the Menorah. If you want to send it out, ask Deborah to send it out to everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Barbara?
Yeah, Mike, you said he went to Rothschild, but you didn't say if Rothschild gave him money, treated him like Hirsch, or what happened when he went to Rothschild?
I mean, he didn't go to Rothschild as he went to Hirsch. He wrote the Jewish state as basically a public appeal. And Rothschild indeed ultimately became a supporter of the Zionist movement, although Rothschild was more of, his vision was more of the what's called pragmatic Zionism or practical Zionism as opposed to political, a distinction that I'll make more clear next week. But that's more of the this farm here, you know, that vineyard there. that Rothschild never really bought into this notion that you were going to convince the powers of the world to sort of like make a big move and just create a state.
Okay, thanks.
Mike, when did Bernard Hirsch change his views? And he was involved, you mentioned Russia, but we know he was involved in Latin America and Canada and so on.
Sure.
When did he start focusing on Israel? Change his mind about Herzl?
I do not know.
Okay.
Look into it, but I do not know. Okay, folks. Thank you so much for the attention and the effort, and we'll see you all next week.